Well, thanks, Brandon and Jim, for organizing this, and thanks everyone for being here. So first of all, this effort that I'm going to tell you about this afternoon is collaborative on a bunch of levels. In terms of the scientists that are involved, we have a lot of different organizations and folks that have contributed to this. Justin Derner and I are involved from ARS, USDA ARS, and then Maria Fernandez Jimenez and Haley Wilmer are involved from Colorado State University. Emily Kachergis was a postdoc with us, and now she's at BLM, and then David Brisky from Texas A&M, and Ken Tate and Leslie Roche from UC Davis. We're all involved in developing this effort. And this, what I'll be telling you about, this is our Colorado version of CALM, and it's very similar and has been implemented parallel to the one that you heard about earlier from Leslie if you were here for her presentation. Okay, so what I'll do with this talk, first I'll tell you a little bit about the motivating factors for our effort and what we mean when we talk about collaborative adaptive landscape management from our perspective. And then I'll tell you about the experiment that we're running in the shortgrass steppe of Colorado, and follow up with a little bit about challenges and lessons learned and a few initial outcomes. So first of all, one of the motivating factors for what we've been doing is the disconnect between manager experience and scientific evidence. This goes back to the Brisky et al. Review on rotational grazing, and also to the SEEP effort, and in particular the chapter on conservation benefits of rangeland practices. And what we wanted to focus in on, and where we felt that there was a lot of controversy, was in rotation of livestock on the landscape and what role that plays in achieving outcomes in rangelands. And based on the SEEP chapter here, some of the key recommendations that came out of that effort published in 2011 were to use adaptive management to optimize conservation benefits, to integrate ecological scales and human dimensions, and to expand conservation science partnerships. And so we wanted to build on these recommendations with some of our research. Another motivating factor in our system, eastern Colorado shortgrass steppe, is high variability and uncertainty. That's true in terms of soils, but it's especially true in terms of precipitation. This is a record of annual precipitation from 1939 to 2013, and you can see the variability there. In the 1960s, we went from 5 inches to 22.5 inches in the span of just a couple years. And in this system in particular, about 70 to 80% of the precipitation comes in the summer, well after you've made a lot of your stocking rate decisions. We're not relying very much on winter or spring precipitation inputs, and so that really compounds the uncertainty for decision making. And then another motivating factor was lack of trust and communication among stakeholders. In my mind, I think the lack of trust is very closely related to just lack of communication and people really understanding what other entities involved in public lands in eastern Colorado are doing. But certainly that this involves lack of communication between conservation organizations, not understanding the grazing management practices involved with either what the ranchers are doing or the agencies are doing. And then another motivating factor for us, traditionally, at least for the national grasslands and the western Great Plains, they've been managed primarily for recovery from the Dust Bowl, so managed for soil recovery, vegetation recovery, and for livestock production. And it's only been in the past 20 years or so that greater attention has been paid to wildlife habitat and wildlife conservation issues on these lands. One driving motivating factor in our region for this collaborative adaptive landscape management approach has been declining grassland bird populations. So grassland birds that breed in the Great Plains have been identified as one of the most rapidly declining guilds of birds in North America, and most of the species of conservation concern in the region are grassland birds. Okay, so next, what do we mean from our perspective in Colorado on the CALM acronym? So first of all, I'll start with adaptive management. What we wanted to do was to involve application of experimentation to the design and implementation of resource management. And so we did think that involving experimentation was an extremely important component to adaptive management. And then second, that management's designed both to increase learning and achieve management objectives. And then in terms of the word collaborative, what we wanted to do was to involve multiple stakeholders, to draw on all types of knowledge inputs, and to focus on this conservation science partnership, or integrating management and science. And then the landscape term, what we really wanted to do, some of the talks this afternoon have really taken that big picture perspective, and some of the talks have been more focused on a particular landscape. We're in that latter group. We really wanted to just try to look at adaptive grazing management within a small enough landscape where we could apply experimentation, but within a large enough landscape that it would have relevance to management, and also address this grassland bird issue, which you can't really address at, say, a pasture or a small part of a property. It needs to be at a landscape scale. So next I'll tell you about our effort, this collaborative adaptive grazing management experiment that we started 3 years ago. So what we did was, this involves 10 stakeholders, and we have a 10-year time frame for the experiment. We took 6,400 acres, or 10 square miles, from our experimental range in northeastern Colorado to conduct this study, and it involves about 400 steers that are provided by livestock grazing cooperative. The experiment's being run in northeastern Colorado, and it's on the Central Plains Experimental Range, shown there in brown, which is located on the western edge of the Pawnee National Grassland. And then this is the Central Plains Experimental Range outlined there in green. That's a 16,000 acre property, and we took 10 square miles of that. And within each one of those 10 square miles, we divided it in half. So one half section, 320 acres, was assigned, within each of those 10 pairs is assigned to a traditional grazing management treatment that's continuous season-long grazing from May to October. And then the other half, those are the blue pastures shown there, was assigned to this adaptive grazing management treatment. And so to decide what is this adaptive grazing management treatment going to look like, what we did is we brought together a diverse stakeholder group. We have 10 people on our stakeholder group, and the composition, it has 4 ranchers. Those are the ranchers that are providing the cattle and that are members of the Crow Valley Grazing Livestock Association that grazes on Pawnee also. And then we also have 3 representatives from conservation organizations. That's the Environmental Defense Fund, Nature Conservancy, and Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory. And then we have 3 representatives from agencies. So that's the Forest Service. Kim is our representative there, and then the NRCS and CSU Extension. And so what we did is we brought this group together, and we asked them, the 10 stakeholders, to design the adaptive grazing management treatment. We said, we're going to give you these 10 pastures. What do you want out of that land, and what do you think you can do to produce those outcomes above and beyond what you could achieve with continuous season-long grazing? So the first workshop we started in 2012. We had small group breakout sessions people to get to know each other and to mainly to develop the goals and objectives for this set of 10 pastures. And this is going to look similar to what Leslie presented earlier, but the overall goal that the group decided on is they want to manage these lands in order to pass it on to future generations for economic and ecological sustainability. To make that a little bit more specific, they broke that down into 3 sets of goals: vegetation, profitable ranching operations, and wildlife. And then they developed a set of specific objectives underneath each of those. And I won't go through them all. A little different from what you see from the California stakeholder group. That's because we're not concerned about weeds. That doesn't show up here anywhere. And also some differences in terms of how we're going to approach the goals for wildlife. We also had some discussion of strategies, how different types of management strategies relate to each of the objectives, and then how different management strategies might relate to multiple objectives. And we didn't go much beyond that. Then we started developing an adaptive management plan for how we might run this in the first year of the experiment. In terms of the first workshop, what we learned, first of all, I think a lot of the stakeholders coming in, there was a lot of perceived conflict. Some of them were quite concerned about how the interactions with other stakeholders would work out. By the end of the first workshop, I think most of them felt that the goals, in fact, were more similar among all of them than previously thought. So that was one positive outcome. The second workshop was held in January of 2013, and this is where we started to get into a lot more of the details of the experiment and how it would be run. We discussed decisions for within-season timescales, year-to-year timescales, and then long-term multi-year timescales. And one of the things we really tried to focus on was, in terms of that rotational, how the cattle are going to be moved within those 10 pastures and the timing of grazing in each pasture. We wanted to have developed measurable criteria to address this issue of transparency and how things are being decided on as cattle are moved around. So to begin the experiment, the group decided to start managing them, their animals as one herd of 200 steers. So this contrasts with the traditional management, which that treatment has 10 herds of 20 steers. And then they wanted to try to rest 2 pastures each year based on average precipitation conditions and grazing 8 of the remaining pastures. And movements would consider all these things, and we spent a lot of time discussing this. This was a decision tree approach for moving cattle among pastures, so I won't go into it in any detail. And then collaborative decision-making process, what we had to decide on was how we're going to make decisions as a group, and it would be that we'd strive for consensus, and as a fallback, we'd have a supermajority for making decisions, recognizing that sometimes we just need to make decisions and move forward. We developed a monitoring plan at another workshop, or actually there's a couple of workshops, but we developed a monitoring plan for livestock, vegetation, and grassland birds. This is what the layout of the plots looks like for vegetation and birds. So we have 16 transects, and they're overlaid with points for monitoring bird populations. And then we have a lot of detailed measurements that go into what's happening with the cattle. What we learned from the monitoring workshops was a lot of discussion about research level measurements versus measurements that ranches or agencies might actually be able to use, and the fact that we're spending a lot more money on this than any typical allotment or ranch would allocate towards this. So in our monitoring plan, I think one of the things we've done is a lot of the more detailed research level measurements are linked back to a simpler method. And so the simpler methods can be looked at in terms of how much do we learn from those versus how much do we need to know from the more detailed methods in terms of our decision making moving forward. January and April workshops, we decided that the first year, 2013, we just focus on baseline measurements of all pastures under continuous season-long grazing to get 1 year of our monitoring plan implemented before the treatments went in, and then our adaptive grazing management treatment started in 2014. While we were doing that first year of baseline measurements, that gave us some time. We did pasture tours and meetings in the fall of 2013 and the winter and spring of 2014, and I think those were useful in allowing the stakeholders to get out, visit sites, and get to know the pastures a little bit better. And then we just had our first year of implementation here over the summer of 2014. Again, we had 200 approximately, we ended up stocking it a little bit above that, but approximately 200 steers that went through these pastures. We did weekly monitoring of visual obstruction to go into our criteria for when cattle moved among pastures. And we had above average precipitation, so what ended up happening is we ended up rotating through 7 of the pastures, and we only needed to use 7 of the pastures based on the criteria we set for movements, and 3 of them ended up being rested because we had such an above average production year. And this is just what some of the monitoring results look like spatially. This is just vegetation structure as measured in June of 2013 and 14. And what you can see, it's the same thing. Yeah, we're monitoring rainfall, and just like Nathan said, but you can see, for example, one here, this pasture, this is where we started grazing early, and by having the baseline measurements from 2013, we are able to detect some effects of management, and our goal is here to really be able to tease out some of those management-rainfall interactions. One finding from 2014 is that our AGM, that's the adaptive grazing management herd, they gained weight at a much lower rate than the continuous season-long grazing treatment over 2014. This is even with very good precipitation in 2014, so that reflects the fact that they only grazed 7 of those pastures. And we also found that when they're grazing in that large herd of 200 animals, they're crude protein intake level is significantly lower than what you get under continuous season long. And this is some GPS collars on the cattle. The upper one is a 20 head herd. The bottom one is the 200 head herd, but just 2 individuals in each of those herds. And you can see on the bottom, the individuals in those larger herds are grazing in much more linear pathways because they're able to be less selective because they're grazing in a large herd. And as a result, we got significantly lower weight gains from those animals. So what we learned, what we saw in this first year is we see some trade-offs between reduced cattle gains that were the result of us trying to achieve these other goals related to future drought mitigation. So we've got 3 pastures that were rested. We got a lot more residual in those pastures, in the adaptive grazing management pastures going into the 2015 grazing season. And we also did that to try to contribute what we hope we'll see are some goals for C3 perennial restoration. And we did also see increased habitat for grasshopper sparrows. But we're starting to see some trade-offs here, and we'll need to work on how we weigh those in future decision making. In terms of process challenges, we've had some turnover in the stakeholder group. It's just maintaining interest. We've, I think, overcome that by just having organizations holding positions on the stakeholder group and allowing them to replace people as people change jobs. We discussed a little bit in some of our design. There have been things that the stakeholders wanted to do that simply would have compromised the experimental design of it, and so there have been some constraints that the stakeholders have had to deal with in order to keep that experimental design. And we've also, as researchers, have had to change some of what we thought was going to happen because of what stakeholders wanted to do. Technical and conceptual challenges. We've had a lot of discussion about pasture-specific objectives versus landscape scale objectives, and how to place value on different outcomes. And then we're still working through some issues on how to balance short-term opportunities versus long-term outcomes. In terms of initial outcomes, we've seen trust built and communication improved in the stakeholder group over time. I think, especially here in 2014, the group is working together really well. And so far, we've successfully completed 1 annual cycle of calm. We have just recently met in January and used all of our monitoring data from 2014 in terms of trying to make decisions on what we're going to do in 2015. And I've demonstrated how this process works to stakeholders. And just like to thank all the collaborators and partners. I think there's at least 2 of the stakeholders are here today, and thank them for all their efforts. And if you're interested in the project, we do have our own webpage and all the monitoring results, the management plan, and all that kind of information's up there. It has a long government web URL, but if you just type ARS Adaptive Grazing Management into Google, it's the first one that comes up. And if I have some time, I'll take questions.